This is going to be your essential review for policy. The last few videos have been super long, so I'm going to try to make this one fast. And with fiscal policy, this is the way that our government decides to influence the economy based on how they tax and how they spend. And there's different perspectives on how the government does this. We have supply side and we have demand side. With supply side, this is the idea that our government should make tax cuts, that the availability of money in our pockets because of those tax cuts will allow us to stimulate and resuscitate the government. On the demand side, this is the thought that we need to have more programs and more money put into things that would resuscitate our government. So this was kind of the focus on the government fixing that. So with demand side economics, if the problem is something like low productivity, or if the problem is unemployment, on a demand side perspective, this would be if the government was to flood money into a program that would create jobs, or flood money into a way that businesses would increase productivity. So this is what you saw with Franklin Roosevelt. With the supply side, this would be massive tax breaks. This would fit into what Ronald Reagan called trickle-down economics. With either approach, the focus of the government is to either regulate, and well, not either. The focus is to regulate and to maintain spending in the United States. The federal budget entitlements that go into this offer, or when I say federal budget or federal government entitlements, what I'm referring to is providing individual benefits for people, and that's established through our government's legislation. I'll come back to that in just a minute, though. But sometimes this is done through categorical grants, where different states or different people, different school systems, for example, are given money, or the states are given money for special programs. So when we have title programs for either low socioeconomic schools, or we have title programs that go into making sure that there is gender equality, or outlets or programs are provided equally for male and female students through Title IX. This would be an example of a categorical grant that would go to the schools. Sometimes the government also provides other benefits for businesses in the United States. So sometimes the government might make sure that we have low interest loans and government guaranteed loans. Sometimes the federal government makes sure that we have, well, going back to schools, we have a national education system that actually works out really well for businesses, because you have highly educated, hopefully, employees. A national transportation system helps out businesses because people can get to and fro, and then also corporate tax breaks. Those are just examples of ways that our government helps out businesses. Something that we haven't talked too much in classes about is the Fed. And the Fed was created in 1913. When it was first created, it did not have a very large role in the management of the nation's economy, but now the Federal Reserve does control the flow and the money supply in the United States. So they maintain the raising or the lowering of the cash reserve that member banks of the Federal Reserve are allowed to deposit in the Federal Reserve, and they also maintain and establish the rising and lowering of interest rates that the member banks of the Federal Reserve are charged when they borrow from the Federal Reserve. So if you've ever heard of that interest rate percentage, or that number, that actually comes and is established by the Federal Reserve. A major point of discussion that surrounds the Federal Reserve and their role in the economic policy of the United States is the fact that the Federal Reserve has kind of an unclear accountability. So members of the Federal Reserve are appointed, the board are appointed by the president, and they're not subject to removal, so they don't have direct election. The American people are kind of they're directly affected, but the American people have no voice directly on who gets put into those positions. There are some other different entities, though, that have congressional members and other executive members who make them up, that regulate business competition. And that would be the Federal Trade Commission. You also have the Interstate Commerce Commission, and then another example that is in the judicial branch, the Justice Department, would be the Antitrust Division. And so those are examples of legislative and executive branch members who make sure that our economy is regulated and are following federal laws. I think the next thing I want to get into, let me make a quick point, and that is that there are situations where the federal government decides in regard to economic regulation that they want to give back a little bit of the power to the states, and they decide that they want to leave things up for the states to decide on. So this falls into the realm of the 10th Amendment. And when this happens, when the federal government decides we're going to leave this to the discretion of the state, this process is called devolution. So it looks like evolution, you just put a D in the front. So they devolve their control and they say we're going to let the states make their mind up on these, whatever the situation might be. And so this is why you might have different tax rates, you might have different regulations when it comes to different types of businesses operating from state to state. And that's actually why sometimes certain businesses will build factories in one state and they'll stay away from another. Okay, let's just kind of run through some major points of interest with economic and social policy, a little bit of foreign policy sprinkled in over the past little over a century. If we go back to the progressive era that we had mentioned when we were talking about the executive branch originally, because we were talking about some different presidential runs or epochs that we had in the United States. In the progressive age, we have this mass uprising of monopolies, and we have these different families or entrepreneurs who are just dominating the United States, especially with steel. So we have the railroad system and a lot of very similar organizations that are just dominating the United States. So we have the Rockefellers popping up during this time. The Vanderbilts are coming very popular during this time period too. And so the federal government gets involved to make sure that business practices are kosher. And we have a big push through this time period to make sure that there are child labor laws, that there's a reasonable number of hours in the work week, there's minimum wage. Then if we jump ahead a few decades, we have the beginning of the modern era of the United States fiscal policy, and that's ushered in by Franklin Roosevelt. And so what he does is he initiates government-ran social insurance programs. So with Franklin Roosevelt, when he becomes president, in 1930, when he becomes president in the election of 32, we jump to 1935, and we have the establishment of the Federal Income Contribution Act. And this is what we talked about in class. This is FICA. But what's so important about that is that social insurance through Social Security and Medicaid becomes something that our government is going to protect. And it's also during 1935 that we have another very important piece of legislation, and that's the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. And what this does is it makes it legal for workers to participate in collective bargaining. So a great amount of ownership is given to workers in the year of 1935. Then we jump ahead again to Lyndon B. Johnson. This is under his Great Society, when he decides to focus on a lot of social programs. He wants to make sure that Brown versus Board of Education is being followed, that schools are being desegregated. He also initiates the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and as we discussed in class, this is an act that was put into question very recently in Shelby v. Holder, and this focused in specifically on sections 4 and 5 on the formula that's used with preclearance. So just be sure that you can tie all that together. Jump up again to 1979, and what we have in our economy is the highest rate of inflation since World War II, and the number was 13%. So we're in the situation where we have massive inflation, and over the past 4 decades, we have seen that the burden of federal taxation has shifted from corporations to individuals. And out of this, the debate about different styles of taxation, different tax brackets. I'd mentioned in a previous video about how the number of brackets that once existed have really been slimmed down, but this is where you would bring in terms like progressive tax, flat tax. And in 1985, Congress passes the Gramm-Rudman Act to try to maintain that our national deficit is lowered to a specific or a pre-specified level each year. Today, 15% of our entire federal budget accounts for just the interest that's paid on our national debt. And speaking of that, as Congressman Collins mentioned to us on Friday, every single one of us, he said 53,000, and I just now checked the national debt clock. What it's actually up to now is $588,000 per person. So probably by the time I'm talking to you, we've probably hit $54,590,000. So if you want to go and have some nightmares, go check that out. On top of this staggering number, the other thing that we have to consider is a lot of questions that surround Social Security. Is it going to be there by the time you turn 65? You have life expectancy levels raising. You have the question of privatization of Social Security, whether or not people should be putting their savings now into an account that only they would be able to access. And so this is a major restructuring of what was initiated in 1935, if that's what ends up happening with FICA. Okay, one area of let's talk a little bit about non-economic policies. Specifically, out of the last 2 decades, we have first the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is an example of a federal mandate that provides protections for the disabled. It's a very important piece of legislation that you're going to need to keep in the back of your mind. Another area of domestic policy that we're now hearing more about in the United States is our environmental policy. And just to show connection across the board from the executive branch, the legislative branch, and then now jumping over to our policy, our national parks, which fall under the Department of the Interior, do have to follow regulations. One of those would be the Environmental Protection Act. There's an agency that oversees this, and they want to make sure that we have a multi-purpose or a many-use policy for our national parks. There's preservation, there's recreation, but interest groups make sure that there's also exploitation to some degree of the natural resources. There's things in the ground, there's things that are growing that we can use, and so they want to make sure that they are being used. But at the same time, as I said, our policy is also to preserve and maintain, and so this is kind of a balancing act that goes on. So I just wanted to try to bring those things together. Connected with foreign policy, though, there was the Kyoto Agreement that was initiated a few years back, that was supposed to be a multi-nation effort to reduce carbon emissions. And the United States, just so you know, is the #1 or largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world per capita. And so at the time, President George W. Bush said no way to the agreement for a lot of different reasons, but it was looking like a lot of our economic competitors were not going to sign on to this agreement as well, and so it was going to give them a pretty big leg up on the global economic platform. Probably what I want to leave you with is one of the biggest and most recent items of public policy in the United States, and this is something that could still be on the AP exam because of when it happened. It was about the same time they were writing the exam last spring, summer, when this was going on. It was actually finalized in June, I believe, and this would be the court case that's known as the United States versus Windsor. And what U.S. v. Windsor stated is that in regard to DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, when the Defense of Marriage Act restricted marriage to be defined as between a man and a woman, so heterosexual marriages, what U.S. versus Windsor did is the Supreme Court stated, that this was a violation of due process in the Fifth Amendment. So U.S. v. Windsor, it strikes down DOMA. That's the connection there, and this is an item of public policy within the United States. Okay, guys, there you have it. There is your essential review for public policy, economic policy, foreign policy, all blended up together. And if you're not able to tease that out, that's actually really good, because you need to see how those different arenas interact with each other. Anyway, so I'm going to bed.